We are going to cover the whole chapter 6 today. Now, before you get too impressed with me, just realize that this is an abbreviated chapter, okay? There's only 15 verses, okay? So it's not like I'm going to do some super marathon or anything like that. But I've kind of found that I'm good for about 11 or 12 verses at a time, you know? And then any more than that typically, and that's too much for me to choose. So 15 verses will complete the whole chapter. And I want to start by just telling you guys a little bit of story of something I encountered earlier this week. I was on social media and I was debating with this guy, and I really even shouldn't call it debating because, I wasn't necessarily disagreeing with him, and he actually had some nuggets of truth in it. But his premise, or what he was talking about, was that how we could solve all the problems in the church would be to get rid of buildings and get rid of salaries. Okay, so no church salaries, no church building. I was like, okay, well, that gets rid of the financial issue, you know. You don't have to pay for a building and all the things that go along with that. You don't have to pay a pastor, you don't have to pay, utilities and all those things that go into that. And I kind of understand what he was talking about, but I do believe that even though there's some nuggets of truth in that, there's a little bit of a flawed premise in that as well. See, one thing that we learned last week is that the geographic location of where we worship doesn't matter, right? We can worship God anywhere. And so we don't need a building. What he was talking about with that part is true. We don't need brick and mortar to be able to worship God. We don't need a building for us to come together as a church family. We don't need it. It's convenient, it's good, but we don't need it. Okay, now the second topic that he was talking about, the part of church salaries, there's a nugget of truth in that as well, believe it or not. See, we have to realize that in a large way, churches have become businesses. And part of the problem with this really stems from our government. They say if you want to be tax-free, if you want to be considered a legitimate church, you need to get a business license, right? You got to jump through these hoops, and then we will declare you as tax exempt, that kind of thing. And so we have permission from our government to be able to be a church. And we jump through those hoops because we don't want to be considered a cult or some strange sect that's off into obscurity, But in a large way, churches have become businesses. And it kind of seems like what I've witnessed with churches is that it seems to be the larger they get, the more business-like they get, and there's a lot of sadness to that. Now, before we get too deep into this, I just want to say that I love small churches. I love pastoring this church. I love being part of a small church. But every format of church has issues, right? There is no perfect church. And so, there's certain things that we can do as a small fellowship that a large church cannot do, and vice versa. There's things that a large church can do that we don't have the resources to do, right? We don't have the space. Whatever it is, we have issues too. And what this guy was suggesting was that everybody should just be part of home fellowships, right? Everybody should be worshiping in homes, and that should be the norm, okay? There's problems with that too. Has anybody ever been a part of a home group or home fellowship? They're a sweet time of fellowship. They really are. It's fun to get together in a small environment again, break bread together, share life with one another. But there's some issues, and then those of you who have been part of that, you're trying to study the Bible and kids are running around the house, and you hear something break and you're like, oh my gosh, let's just pray right now, kind of a thing. We're going to cut it short tonight, kind of a thing. There's issues to it. It's a lot of work for those who are hosting the home fellowship, And so there is no perfect format that's going to work. But in defense of churches and and having church buildings, I think that the format works pretty well, especially given our culture, what we desire as people. It seems to fit pretty well. But, I'm always open to listening to things like that and considering, well, what would it be like? What if we dissolved the building? What if we just went from house to house like what we read of in Acts? But one of the things that I pointed out to this guy in my discussion with him was that, when we read the book of Acts, they did go house to house, right? And they broke meals on a daily basis together. But last week we learned that they met at Solomon's temple, right? They had a collective place where they could go to meet as a church family, as a larger body. That's pretty hard to do if you're just doing homes. And so there's some issues with it too, no question. Now, one of the things that we have to think about when we're talking about church, or really this comes down to us as individual believers, right? We are all called to fulfill the Great Commission. Every one of us. If you're a born-again believer, you are called into the ministry. And I think a lot of times we don't think about that much. It's easy just to come to church, not really thinking that you're part of the ministry. But Jesus is literally calling you into ministry. And so, what does that look like for us, right? Not many of us receive pay when it comes to doing ministry. Much of it we do for free. We do it as charity or as voluntary basis. And that's okay. I think that's great as well. I was really blessed last week when me and my wife were talking about this when we went home later the day after the potluck. I was like, it's so awesome. Our church fellowship is such a healthy body. It's like it was time for the meal and people just jumped in, set up tables, moved chairs around, got out the food, and it was really a group effort. And, I said, we couldn't do this on our own. If it was just me and you and we tried to set all that stuff and put that on, there's no way we could do that, right? It takes a church body, it takes a family to pull that off. And so we all play a part. And I just want to remind you guys that regardless of what part you play in the church, in ministry, it all goes towards the sharing of the gospel, right? That's why we're here. The gospel comes out in the music, it comes out in the teaching, it comes out in the way you guys love each other, speak words of encouragement to each other, right? It's all about the gospel. And so it doesn't matter what you do in the church, that's the main focus of why you are serving in the first place, or at least it should be. Let me phrase it that way. Now, this is not the first time I've heard of this. I've heard and witnessed many groups of people that have tried to do this thing, of, hey, let's not meet at a building. While the weather's nice, we'll meet in the park. If it gets too hot or too cold, we'll go meet in homes. It'll be great. We won't have, any bills, nothing like that. And I've seen people attempt to do this. And nearly every time, what typically happens is the group dissolves, right? It'll go for a while. They'll get some great traction. It'll go for 6 months, 8 months, a year and a half if they're lucky. But then it falls apart. And typically what happens is either the group gets too big, we can't meet in a home anymore, so it fractures, splits into two groups, and then one group is like, well, I miss Betty, I need to be with Betty, and whatever, it falls apart. I've seen it happen multiple times. Now, the times that it does work, you know what the people end up doing? They solidify, they become one body. They said, we've got something here. We got a church. And so they'll go rent a building, institute the church, get organized, and now voila, they have a church. And so I think it's great. But I don't think that we should ever neglect the idea that we should have a public place where we should meet. You know, Christianity is a way of life, right? And so it should never cease to exist once we leave these doors, right? We should be going home, living the Christian life. We should be getting together with other believers outside of the church, living the Christian life. That's what Jesus wants us to do. And so I think really it's important to have both, you know? But that's typically what happens. It becomes a church anyways. And granted, a lot of that's our culture, right? We expect to have shelter. We expect to have a building. You know, maybe if you go to a third world country where they're not used to having a heater and air conditioner, they're used to dirt floors, right? They'll just meet in the streets, have a worship service. Maybe they all try to gather in a hut, right? You've seen pictures of this. They have different expectations. They have different norms for their society. And so they roll with the punches a little bit differently than we do. But it still comes back to having that fellowship, right? We gotta be together some way. Now, whatever that looks like is great. Now, when it comes to finances, you know, it is true. It does cost money to pay the mortgage, to pay the utilities, the coffee, the sweet treats, Sunday school supplies, and yes, salaries. My pastor in Meridian, bless his heart, every Sunday, immediately following New Year's Day, he would do almost like a state of the church. He would do a financial update, and he'd pull out these charts of, this is how much money the church gave this year, and this is how much we gave away in tithes, that sort of thing, and this is how much we spent on Sunday school, women's ministry, all these things, right? He'd have a nice pie chart. That is not me. I do not like talking about church finances. I just do not get excited about the thing. I love numbers, I love statistics, but I don't really like to get up in front of the church and talk about those things. But I do like to be transparent. I do like to let you guys know what's going on. And I just want to say as a side note too, you know, if anyone ever has any discomfort about the finances of the church, you're more than welcome to sit down with me and Carla, and we'll show you the books. You know, it's just open. We don't publish it, but you're welcome to look at it, see how we spend our money. And it's not a lot of money anyway, so don't get too excited. But, you know, if that's something you want to see, we're more than welcome to sit down